The one emotion high achievers never show in public. Introduction. The smile behind the pressure. Nobody notices the breaking point of high achievers. Because high achievers learn very early how to suffer quietly. They smile while exhausted. They perform while emotionally collapsing. They continue producing, winning, leading, building, improving, achieving. And the world applauds them for it. That is the strange thing about modern ambition. The more pain someone hides, the more impressive they often appear. The exhausted entrepreneur is called disciplined. The emotionally disconnected athlete is called mentally strong. The overworked student is called dedicated. The man who never expresses emotion is called masculine. The woman destroying herself trying to prove her worth is called ambitious. Nobody asks what these people are running from. Because society has become obsessed with appearances of strength, not emotional truth. And somewhere in that obsession, millions of people quietly learned a dangerous lesson. If you perform well enough, nobody will notice your suffering. That lesson changes people. Slowly. Silently. At first, ambition feels inspiring. You want to become more. You want to improve your life. You want respect, freedom, recognition, success. There is nothing wrong with ambition itself. Ambition can build beautiful things. It can create art, businesses, movements, innovation, discipline, transformation. But ambition becomes dangerous when achievement stops being a dream and becomes emotional survival. That is the hidden psychological shift almost nobody talks about. Because from the outside, high achievers often look powerful. But internally, many are driven by something much darker, the fear of not being enough. Not smart enough. Not successful enough. Not respected enough. Not valuable enough. Not unforgettable enough. This fear rarely announces itself openly. It hides beneath productivity, beneath confidence, beneath discipline, beneath perfectionism, beneath endless goals and impossible standards. And because the world rewards achievement so aggressively, these emotional wounds often remain invisible for years. Sometimes decades. A person can spend their entire life appearing successful while secretly feeling emotionally inadequate. That contradiction is the emotional foundation of this book. Because many high achievers are not only chasing success, they are chasing relief. Relief from shame. Relief from insecurity. Relief from the terrifying feeling that without achievement, they may have no value at all. This creates a painful psychological trap. The more they achieve, the more validation they receive. The more validation they receive, the more their identity becomes dependent on achievement. And eventually, they no longer know who they are without performance. That is why some people cannot rest without guilt. Why silence feels uncomfortable. Why productivity becomes addictive. Why failure feels emotionally catastrophic. Why compliments feel necessary. Why burnout becomes inevitable. Why loneliness grows even during success. And why some of the most admired people in the world secretly feel emotionally exhausted. Modern culture rarely sees this side of achievement. It only sees results, followers, money, status, titles, awards. But behind many impressive lives exists an invisible emotional reality the public never witnesses. The panic attacks hidden behind discipline. The emotional numbness disguised as professionalism. The loneliness hidden behind leadership. The shame hidden behind perfectionism. The exhaustion hidden behind motivation. This book is not about weakness. It is about emotional truth. Because emotional suppression has become normalized in ambitious people, especially men. Many men are taught from childhood that emotions reduce their value. That vulnerability is dangerous. That sadness makes them weak. That struggle should remain private. So they learn to perform strength instead of experiencing honesty. They become emotionally efficient, functional, productive, reliable, but internally disconnected. Many women experience a different version of the same pressure. They feel forced to constantly prove themselves, to succeed without appearing emotional, to remain attractive while being competent, to achieve without becoming too much, to carry emotional burdens silently. Different pressures, same emotional exhaustion. And over time, both men and women begin constructing identities based entirely around performance, not authenticity. Performance. That distinction changes everything, because performance-based identities are fragile. They depend on external reinforcement, applause, recognition, results, success. Without those things, many ambitious people experience emotional collapse, not because they are weak, but because achievement became their emotional foundation. And no human being can psychologically survive forever when their self-worth depends entirely on performance. Eventually, the nervous system breaks. The mind becomes exhausted. Relationships become emotionally distant. Life starts feeling mechanical, and many people reach a terrifying moment they never expected. They achieve what they once dreamed about, and still feel empty. That emptiness confuses them. Because society promised achievement would create fulfillment. But achievement alone cannot heal emotional wounds. Success can distract insecurity, amplify identity, temporarily silence shame, but it cannot replace emotional self-worth. This is why some of the most outwardly successful people quietly struggle with anxiety, burnout, depression, emotional numbness, addiction, and loneliness. They built extraordinary external lives while neglecting their internal ones. And the tragedy is that many do not realize this until they can no longer emotionally function. Until burnout forces stillness. Until relationships collapse. Until the mind becomes exhausted. Until silence becomes unbearable. Until they finally ask themselves a question they spent years avoiding: who am I if I stop achieving? That question terrifies many ambitious people. Because beneath the goals, beneath the discipline, beneath the image, there is often an exhausted human being desperate to feel worthy without constantly proving themselves. This book exists for those people. Not to destroy ambition, but to understand it. Not to shame achievement, but to explore the psychology underneath it. Because ambition itself is not the enemy. Self-rejection is. Emotional suppression is. Conditional self-worth is. Living as a permanent performance is. Many readers may recognize themselves in these pages. Some will feel exposed. Others will finally feel understood. You may recognize your own exhaustion, your own perfectionism, your own fear of slowing down, your own addiction to productivity, your own emotional loneliness. You may discover that some of your greatest strengths were actually survival mechanisms. That your discipline sometimes came from fear. That your independence sometimes came from emotional isolation. That your perfectionism came from shame. That your ambition was not always passion. Sometimes it was protection. And understanding that truth changes everything. Because awareness creates freedom. The moment you understand the emotional forces driving your behavior, you stop being unconsciously controlled by them. You begin separating identity from performance, self-worth from achievement, peace from validation. This does not make someone less ambitious. It makes ambition healthier, more sustainable, more human. The goal of this book is not emotional fragility. It is emotional honesty. There is strength in discipline, strength in ambition, strength in resilience. But there is also strength in emotional awareness, strength in vulnerability, strength in admitting exhaustion before collapse, strength in understanding your own mind instead of endlessly running from it. Real strength is not becoming emotionless. Real strength is remaining emotionally connected to yourself while carrying responsibility. That is rare. And that rarity is exactly why so many high achievers silently suffer. Because the world teaches people how to perform. But very few people are taught how to emotionally exist without proving their worth every second of their lives. This book is an exploration of that hidden struggle. The invisible emotional world behind achievement. The psychology of silent suffering. The fear beneath perfectionism. The loneliness inside strength. The exhaustion behind endless productivity. And most importantly, the possibility of becoming successful without emotionally abandoning yourself in the process. Because no achievement is worth losing your identity. No success is worth permanent emotional disconnection. And no amount of admiration can heal a person who secretly believes they are only valuable when they are performing. The strongest people are not the ones who never break. They are the ones willing to understand why they were breaking in the first place. And that journey begins here. Chapter 1. The Performance Mask. There is a version of you the world rewards. And there is a version of you the world never sees. For many high achievers, those two identities slowly become completely different people. One becomes public. The other becomes buried. The public version looks disciplined, focused, confident, emotionally controlled. The private version is exhausted, anxious, afraid of slowing down, terrified of disappointing people, constantly questioning whether any achievement will ever feel like enough. But nobody notices this contradiction at first. Because high achievers become masters of performance. Not fake performance in the obvious sense. Emotional performance. The performance of stability. The performance of confidence. The performance of strength. And the more pain they hide successfully, the more the world admires them. That is how the mask becomes permanent. Not through deception. Through survival. Most people assume emotional masks are intentional. They imagine someone consciously deciding to hide their feelings from the world. But psychological masks rarely begin that way. Usually, they begin much earlier. In childhood. In classrooms. In families. In environments where emotional honesty felt dangerous. A child learns quickly which emotions are acceptable. Which emotions receive attention. Which emotions create rejection. Some children discover that achievement earns praise faster than vulnerability earns comfort. So they adapt. They stop expressing confusion. Stop expressing fear. Stop expressing sadness. Instead, they become useful, successful, reliable, disciplined. And slowly, the child begins constructing an identity around performance. Not because they are manipulative. Because they are trying to feel emotionally safe. That distinction matters. Because many emotionally high-functioning adults are actually emotionally adaptive children who never learned how to exist without proving their worth. Achievement becomes emotional protection. The mask becomes armor. And eventually, the person underneath the armor becomes difficult to recognize. Especially to themselves. This is one of the most dangerous psychological consequences of modern ambition. People become so skilled at performing strength that they lose connection with their authentic emotional state. They no longer ask, "How do I actually feel?" They ask, "How should I appear?" That shift changes everything. Because humans cannot remain emotionally disconnected forever without consequences. Eventually, the nervous system responds. Sometimes through anxiety. Sometimes through burnout. Sometimes through emotional numbness. Sometimes through quiet depression hidden beneath productivity. But the outside world usually misses these warning signs. Because externally, the person still appears successful. Still productive. Still disciplined. Still functioning. That is why high achievers often collapse silently. The performance continues long after emotional exhaustion begins. And modern culture encourages this behavior constantly. People are rewarded for emotional suppression every day. The employee who works through exhaustion is praised. The athlete who ignores pain is admired. The entrepreneur sacrificing sleep is respected. The student destroying their mental health for achievement is celebrated. Society often mistakes self-neglect for dedication. That confusion creates emotionally unhealthy people who look incredibly successful from the outside. Especially men. Many boys are emotionally conditioned very early. They hear phrases like, "Be strong," "Stop crying," "Man up," "Nobody cares," "Handle it yourself." These phrases do not simply change behavior. They shape identity. The boy learns that emotional expression reduces social value. So he adapts. He becomes emotionally controlled, independent, stoic, unreachable. And over time, emotional distance becomes confused with strength. But emotional suppression is not emotional mastery. They are completely different things. Emotional mastery means understanding your emotions without being controlled by them. Emotional suppression means disconnecting from emotions because they feel unsafe. Many high achievers confuse the second for the first. That confusion creates enormous psychological pressure. Because suppressed emotions do not disappear. They accumulate. Silently. Inside the nervous system. Inside relationships. Inside identity. And eventually, the emotional pressure begins leaking into every area of life. A person may become successful while secretly feeling emotionally empty. They may become admired while feeling deeply disconnected. They may become powerful while internally exhausted. This contradiction becomes especially visible at night, during silence, during moments without distraction, because performance requires an audience. But solitude removes the performance. And many ambitious people struggle deeply when no external validation exists to reinforce their identity. This is why some people become addicted to constant productivity. Stillness becomes emotionally uncomfortable. Rest creates guilt. Silence creates anxiety. Because without motion, they are forced to confront emotions they spent years outrunning. That is why some people cannot relax without feeling lazy. Cannot stop working without feeling worthless. Cannot fail without feeling emotionally destroyed. Their identity has fused completely with performance. And when identity becomes dependent on achievement, life becomes psychologically fragile. Every mistake feels personal. Every rejection feels humiliating. Every setback feels like evidence of inadequacy. This creates perfectionism. Not healthy excellence. Fear-based perfectionism. The kind that whispers, "If you are flawless, nobody can reject you." Perfectionism is rarely about standards. It is usually about fear. Fear of judgment. Fear of failure. Fear of humiliation. Fear of not being enough. That fear hides beneath many successful lives, quietly controlling behavior from the background. And because the person appears high-functioning, few people recognize how emotionally exhausted they truly are. Some high achievers even become emotionally admired for their self-destruction. People praise their work ethic, their discipline, their consistency, their grind, without realizing those behaviors may be driven by emotional survival rather than healthy ambition. That is the uncomfortable truth modern culture avoids discussing. Not all discipline is healthy. Sometimes discipline becomes emotional escape. Work becomes distraction. Achievement becomes anesthesia. Success becomes temporary relief from shame. And because achievement temporarily reduces insecurity, the brain begins depending on it emotionally. That dependence creates a cycle. Achievement produces validation. Validation creates temporary emotional relief. The relief fades. The person feels empty again. So they chase another achievement, another goal, another victory, another performance. And eventually, they no longer know how to feel valuable without external success. This is why many high achievers secretly fear slowing down. Because movement protects them from self-confrontation. Stillness removes distraction. And distraction has become psychological survival. Some people spend their entire lives performing competence because they are terrified of emotional exposure. Terrified someone will discover the insecurity, the exhaustion, the loneliness, the fear, the emotional confusion beneath the image, so they continue performing strength, even while collapsing internally. This emotional split creates profound loneliness. Because people cannot feel deeply understood while constantly performing. Others may admire them, respect them, depend on them. But admiration is not the same as emotional intimacy. Being needed is not the same as being known. And many ambitious people secretly experience relationships this way. They become the strong one, the reliable one, the composed one, the successful one. But internally, they feel emotionally unseen. Not because nobody cares. Because they stopped allowing others to see them honestly. The mask protects them, but it also isolates them. That is the tragedy of emotional armor. The same defense mechanism that protects connection also prevents it. Over time, this emotional isolation creates strange psychological symptoms. Some people become numb. Others become emotionally reactive in private. Some experience sudden exhaustion after years of functioning. Some feel disconnected from their own achievements. Others feel guilty resting even when completely burned out. Many do not understand what is happening. Because externally, life may still look successful. But emotional suppression always creates internal consequences eventually. The nervous system keeps records the mind tries to ignore. That is why some people suddenly break down after achieving something major. The achievement removed distraction. And suddenly, all the unresolved emotional pressure surfaces at once. The person expected fulfillment. Instead, they encountered emptiness. That emptiness is psychologically devastating. Because they spent years believing achievement would finally create peace. But peace cannot exist in someone constantly performing worthiness. Peace requires emotional safety. And emotionally unsafe people rarely know how to stop proving themselves. That is why emotional awareness becomes essential for ambitious people. Without self-awareness, ambition can quietly become self-destruction disguised as discipline. The goal is not to eliminate ambition. The goal is to remove shame from underneath it. Healthy ambition says, I want to grow. Unhealthy ambition says, I must achieve or I have no value. Those are completely different emotional realities. One creates fulfillment. The other creates exhaustion. Unfortunately, modern culture rewards the second aggressively. People often admire relentless performers without asking what drives their behavior. But motivation matters psychologically. Two people may work equally hard for entirely different emotional reasons. One works from inspiration. The other works from fear. Externally, they may look identical. Internally, they experience completely different lives. That is why emotional honesty matters more than external appearance. Because many high achievers do not actually need more discipline. They need emotional permission to exist without constantly earning their worth. That realization can feel terrifying. Especially for people whose entire identity was built around performance. Because if the mask disappears, who are they underneath it? That question sits quietly beneath many ambitious lives. And most people avoid it for years. Some avoid it forever. Because confronting the emotional self underneath performance requires vulnerability. And vulnerability feels dangerous to people who survived by appearing strong. But healing begins exactly there. Not when someone becomes less ambitious. When they become less emotionally dependent on achievement for self-worth. That shift changes ambition from survival into expression. And for many people, that is the first time success actually begins feeling meaningful. Because achievement without identity is empty. Achievement without emotional connection is lonely. Achievement without self-worth becomes endless. The performance never stops. The goals never satisfy. The pressure never leaves. Until eventually, the person realizes something painful. They spent years building a successful life without building a peaceful mind. And that realization changes everything. Chapter 2. The hidden shame beneath ambition. Most people think high achievers are driven by confidence. But many are driven by the exact opposite. Shame. Not obvious shame. Not public humiliation. A quieter form. A deeper one. The kind that silently whispers, You are not enough yet. This shame rarely appears openly. It hides beneath discipline, beneath ambition, beneath impossible standards, beneath the constant need to improve. And because society celebrates ambition so aggressively, people often mistake emotional pain for motivation. But there is a major psychological difference between someone inspired by growth and someone emotionally terrified of inadequacy. One moves toward success. The other runs from worthlessness. Externally, they may look identical. Internally, they live completely different emotional realities. This hidden shame becomes the emotional engine behind many ambitious lives. Not because high achievers are weak. Because many learned very early that achievement increased their value. The child who received praise only after success. The teenager admired only when productive. The student loved more when exceptional. The athlete noticed only when winning. The person slowly absorbs a dangerous emotional equation. If I achieve, I matter. That belief changes the nervous system. Because now achievement is no longer just a goal. It becomes identity. And once identity attaches itself to performance, failure becomes psychologically threatening. Not disappointing. Threatening. That is why some ambitious people react to mistakes with extreme emotional intensity. Because failure does not simply damage outcomes. It damages self-worth. A rejected business idea becomes, maybe I am not good enough. A failed relationship becomes, maybe I am unlovable. A bad performance becomes, maybe I was never valuable to begin with. This is what hidden shame does. It transforms ordinary human experiences into emotional verdicts about identity. And people experiencing this rarely understand what is happening internally. They simply feel constant pressure. Pressure to improve. Pressure to prove themselves. Pressure to avoid becoming insignificant. This pressure often creates perfectionism. But perfectionism is deeply misunderstood. Most people think perfectionists are obsessed with excellence. In reality, many perfectionists are obsessed with avoiding shame. Perfection becomes emotional protection. If they make no mistakes, nobody can criticize them. If they become exceptional enough, nobody can reject them. If they achieve enough success, maybe they will finally feel worthy. But the problem with shame-based achievement is that no accomplishment permanently heals the wound underneath it. The emotional relief never lasts. A promotion creates satisfaction for a few days. Recognition feels good temporarily. Praise creates a brief emotional high. Then the nervous system resets. And the shame quietly returns. So the person sets another goal. Works harder. Pushes further. Sacrifices more. Not realizing they are trapped inside an emotional cycle achievement can never fully satisfy. This is why some high achievers become addicted to constant movement. Stillness becomes dangerous. Because silence allows shame to surface. And many ambitious people are not running toward greatness as much as they are running away from emotional discomfort. That truth is difficult to accept. Especially in cultures obsessed with productivity. Because modern society romanticizes overwork constantly. People proudly describe themselves as exhausted. Burnout becomes status. Sleep deprivation becomes ambition. Emotional neglect becomes discipline. Nobody asks, "What are you trying not to feel?" That question changes everything. Because behind many obsessive behaviors exists unresolved emotional pain. Some people become addicted to work because achievement distracts them from loneliness. Others become obsessed with status because recognition temporarily silences insecurity. Some constantly improve themselves because they secretly believe they are fundamentally inadequate. And from the outside, these behaviors often look admirable. That is why shame can remain hidden for years. Sometimes entire lifetimes. Because successful shame looks impressive. The person appears driven, focused, disciplined, motivated. But internally, they may feel emotionally trapped, unable to rest, unable to feel satisfied, unable to believe they are worthy without achievement. This creates a painful contradiction. The more successful they become externally, the emptier they may feel internally. Not because success is meaningless. Because success cannot repair an identity built on conditional self-worth. Nothing external can permanently heal internal shame. Not money. Not admiration. Not status. Not success. Not applause. External achievement can distract emotional pain. But distraction is not healing. That distinction matters enormously. Because many ambitious people spend years chasing emotional healing through external accomplishment. And eventually, they reach a devastating realization: achievement changed their life. But it did not change how they feel about themselves. That realization creates confusion. Sometimes depression. Sometimes emotional collapse. Because they believed fulfillment was waiting on the other side of success. But fulfillment requires self-worth independent of performance. Without that foundation, success becomes emotionally unstable. The person constantly needs more. More validation. More achievement. More recognition. More proof they matter. This is why many high achievers secretly fear being ordinary. Ordinary feels emotionally unsafe. Because ordinary people are easier to ignore. Easier to replace. Easier to forget. So they chase significance relentlessly. Not always because they love success. Because invisibility terrifies them. This fear often begins early in life. A child who felt emotionally unseen may later become obsessed with being exceptional. Not consciously. Psychologically. The mind adapts. It learns. If I become impressive enough, people will finally value me. That belief can create extraordinary achievement. But it also creates enormous emotional pressure. Because the person can never fully relax. They are always performing for worthiness. Always improving. Always proving. Always chasing emotional security through accomplishment. And eventually, exhaustion becomes unavoidable. Because human beings are not designed to carry permanent psychological pressure. The nervous system eventually rebels. Sometimes through anxiety. Sometimes through emotional numbness. Sometimes through burnout. Sometimes through quiet despair hidden beneath productivity. But even then, many ambitious people refuse to slow down. Because stopping feels psychologically dangerous. If achievement is their primary source of self-worth, then rest feels like identity loss. That is why some people feel guilty relaxing. Guilty sleeping. Guilty doing nothing. Their nervous system associates stillness with worthlessness. And the more emotionally dependent someone becomes on achievement, the harder it becomes to separate performance from identity. Eventually, they no longer know who they are without goals. Without productivity. Without external progress. That is one of the hidden tragedies of modern ambition. People become extraordinary performers, while remaining emotionally disconnected from themselves. And because the world rewards results more than emotional health, this behavior often goes unnoticed. Until collapse happens. Until relationships suffer. Until exhaustion becomes impossible to ignore. Until the person realizes they built their identity around proving their value instead of understanding it. This is why emotionally healthy ambition matters. Healthy ambition comes from expression, curiosity, growth, purpose. Shame-based ambition comes from fear. Fear of inadequacy. Fear of insignificance. Fear of rejection. Fear of being emotionally exposed as ordinary. One creates fulfillment. The other creates endless pressure. Unfortunately, many people do not recognize the difference until much later in life. After years of emotional exhaustion. After burnout. After success feels empty. After relationships become distant. After anxiety becomes constant. Then they finally begin asking different questions. Not, how do I achieve more? But, why do I feel worthless without achievement? That question is psychologically transformative. Because awareness interrupts unconscious emotional patterns. The moment someone recognizes shame beneath their ambition, healing becomes possible. Not instant, but possible. Because hidden shame loses power when consciously understood. The goal is not to destroy ambition. The goal is to separate ambition from self-hatred. To pursue success without emotionally depending on it for identity. To achieve without believing failure makes you worthless. To improve yourself without secretly despising yourself. That emotional balance changes everything. Because psychologically healthy people do not need achievement to prove they deserve existence. They may still pursue greatness. Still work hard. Still build extraordinary lives. But their identity no longer collapses during failure. Their worth no longer depends entirely on performance. And for many ambitious people, that realization feels almost unimaginable. Because they spent years believing pressure was necessary for success. But fear may create movement, while destroying peace. And eventually, every person must choose, will ambition become a tool for expression? Or a lifelong attempt to escape shame? That answer determines whether success becomes fulfillment, or emotional imprisonment. Chapter 3. Childhood Conditioning. Nobody becomes emotionally disconnected overnight. Nobody wakes up one morning suddenly obsessed with achievement, terrified of failure, unable to rest, and emotionally dependent on productivity. These patterns begin much earlier. Usually in childhood. Long before ambition becomes visible. Long before success enters the picture. Long before the world starts calling someone disciplined, gifted, or driven. The emotional foundations of overachievement are often built quietly during early experiences of love, validation, rejection, pressure, and emotional survival. That is why many ambitious adults are unknowingly living out emotional patterns they learned as children. Patterns they never consciously chose. Patterns their nervous system adapted to automatically. Because childhood is where people first learn one of the most important psychological questions of human life: what makes me worthy of love? The answer to that question shapes identity for years. Sometimes forever. A child does not understand psychology. A child understands emotional consequences. They notice what receives attention. What creates approval. What causes disappointment. What earns affection. What creates distance. And slowly, without words, the child begins adapting. Some children learn, I am loved when I am emotionally honest. Others learn, I am loved when I perform well. That difference changes everything. Because children who receive consistent emotional acceptance usually develop internal safety. But children who receive conditional validation often develop performance-based self-worth. The emotional message becomes, who you are is not enough. You must become impressive. This conditioning can happen in many ways. Not all of them obvious. Some parents openly pressure achievement. Others unintentionally reward performance more than emotional authenticity. A child receives excitement for grades, praise for trophies, attention for success, but emotional struggles receive discomfort, impatience, silence, criticism, or emotional absence. The child notices, even when nobody says it directly. Children are emotionally observant long before they become emotionally articulate. And because survival depends on connection, the child adapts quickly. They become what receives love. If intelligence receives praise, they become intelligent. If achievement receives attention, they become successful. If emotional control receives approval, they suppress vulnerability. This adaptation is not manipulation. It is survival. Humans are biologically designed to protect attachment, especially during childhood. That is why emotionally neglected children often become emotionally hyper-functional adults. They learn very early. My emotions are inconvenient, so they stop expressing them. Not because emotions disappear, because emotional expression stopped feeling safe. Over time, these children become unusually responsible, mature, independent, disciplined. But beneath that competence often exists a deep emotional loneliness. Because children who learn to suppress emotional needs rarely stop needing emotional connection. They simply stop asking for it. This creates one of the most misunderstood psychological patterns in ambitious adults: extreme self-reliance. From the outside, self-reliance looks strong. But psychologically, extreme independence is sometimes an adaptation to emotional disappointment. The person unconsciously believes depending on others is unsafe, so they depend only on themselves, emotionally, financially, psychologically. And while this can create impressive achievement, it can also create enormous emotional isolation, because people who survive by suppressing needs eventually struggle to express them at all. Even in healthy relationships, even when loved, they become uncomfortable receiving support, uncomfortable appearing vulnerable, uncomfortable admitting pain. Because vulnerability became associated with emotional risk long ago, this conditioning shapes ambition powerfully. Many high achievers are not only chasing success, they are chasing emotional security. The child who once felt invisible now wants significance. The child who felt powerless now wants control. The child who felt emotionally rejected now wants admiration. The child who felt not enough now becomes obsessed with proving worth. This is why some people become emotionally addicted to achievement. Success temporarily repairs old emotional wounds. For a moment, the person feels valuable, seen, important, safe. But because the original wound was emotional, external success cannot permanently heal it. The relief fades, and the nervous system begins searching for the next achievement, the next validation, the next proof of worthiness. That cycle can continue for decades, especially in modern culture, where achievement is constantly rewarded. Social media intensifies this dramatically. People now grow up inside permanent comparison, permanent visibility, permanent performance. A child no longer compares themselves only to classmates or neighbors. Now they compare themselves to millions of carefully edited lives online. This creates impossible psychological pressure. Because identity forms through comparison, and constant comparison produces chronic inadequacy. Many young people today secretly believe, if I am not exceptional, I will become irrelevant. That fear creates emotional urgency. The pressure to succeed becomes psychological survival, not aspiration. Survival. This is why so many ambitious people struggle to relax. Their nervous system remains trapped in performance mode, even during rest, even during relationships, even during moments meant for peace. Because deep inside, they still feel emotionally evaluated, still trying to earn worthiness, still trying to avoid disappointment, still trying to become enough. And often, they do not realize these emotional patterns originated years earlier. Childhood conditioning becomes invisible once it turns into personality. The person begins saying, I'm just ambitious, I've always been independent, I just have high standards, I don't need anyone, I hate being weak. But beneath those identities often exists an emotionally conditioned child who adapted to survive emotionally difficult environments. Not all wounds come from obvious trauma. Some come from emotional absence. Some come from constant pressure. Some come from never feeling fully accepted without achievement. Some come from becoming the responsible one too early. Some come from always being compared to others. Some come from growing up around emotionally unavailable adults. Children internalize these experiences deeply, even when the environment appeared normal externally. That is why emotionally successful adults sometimes feel strangely empty later in life. Because their identity was constructed around adaptation rather than authenticity. They became who they needed to become, not necessarily who they truly were. This creates profound emotional confusion in adulthood, especially during stillness, especially during burnout, especially during failure. Because once achievement slows down, unresolved emotional patterns become visible. The person suddenly feels emotions they spent years outrunning: loneliness, fear, exhaustion, insecurity, emptiness. And many ambitious people panic during this phase, because achievement previously protected them from emotional confrontation. Work distracted them. Goals organized them. Success stabilized identity. Without constant movement, they finally encounter themselves honestly. That experience can feel terrifying, especially for people who built their self-worth around performance, because they were never taught how to feel valuable without earning it. This is one of the greatest emotional tragedies of modern achievement culture. People learn how to succeed professionally before learning how to exist emotionally. And eventually, success without emotional stability becomes unsustainable. The nervous system eventually demands attention. No amount of productivity permanently silences unresolved emotional pain. No amount of status creates lasting inner peace. No amount of admiration replaces emotional self-worth. Eventually, every emotionally exhausted achiever reaches the same question: why does nothing feel like enough? The answer often begins in childhood, in the emotional environments that taught them love had conditions, that worth required proof, that vulnerability created danger, that achievement created safety. Understanding this is not about blaming parents. Most parents pass down emotional patterns they never healed themselves. Emotionally neglected people often raise emotionally pressured children without realizing it. People teach what they survived, not always what is healthy. That is why emotional awareness matters. Because unconscious pain repeats itself across generations. The emotionally exhausted father teaches emotional suppression. The perfectionistic mother teaches performance-based worth. The anxious parent teaches fear. The emotionally unavailable parent teaches distance. And the child adapts. Always adapts. Until adaptation becomes identity. But identity built on survival is rarely peaceful. Because survival mode never truly relaxes. It keeps scanning, performing, proving, achieving, trying to secure emotionally what never felt fully safe internally. Healing begins when someone recognizes this pattern consciously, not with shame, with awareness. Because awareness interrupts emotional autopilot, the ambitious adult finally realizes, I was never just chasing success. I was chasing worthiness. That realization changes ambition completely. For the first time, achievement becomes a choice instead of emotional survival. The person can still pursue greatness, still grow, still build extraordinary things, but they stop believing failure destroys their identity. They stop treating rest like weakness. They stop seeing vulnerability as danger. They stop requiring perfection to feel valuable. And slowly, something unfamiliar begins appearing in their life: peace. Not because pressure disappeared, because their worth no longer depends entirely on performance. That emotional shift changes everything. Because the child who once believed love had to be earned, finally begins learning they were worthy before they achieved anything at all. Chapter 4. Why winning feels empty. The most confusing moment in a high achiever's life is not failure. It is success that feels emotionally empty. Because nobody prepares people for that experience. Society teaches a simple equation: work hard, right pointing arrow, achieve success, right pointing arrow, feel fulfilled. But real psychology is far more complicated. Many ambitious people spend years believing happiness exists on the other side of achievement. The promotion, the money, the recognition, the transformation, the status, the dream body, the successful business, the perfect life. And for a brief moment after achieving those things, the emotional reward feels real. There is excitement, relief, validation, a temporary emotional high. Then something strange happens. The feeling disappears, much faster than expected, and suddenly the person feels confused, sometimes guilty, sometimes deeply empty. Because they achieved what they once believed would finally make them feel complete. Yet internally, almost nothing changed. This emotional experience is one of the hidden psychological crises of ambitious people. Because success often changes circumstances faster than identity. Externally, life improves. Internally, the same emotional patterns remain. The same insecurity. The same fear. The same restlessness. The same inability to feel enough. That is why some people become trapped in endless achievement cycles. Every goal creates temporary emotional relief. Then the nervous system adapts. And the mind immediately searches for another target, another accomplishment, another source of validation. This process is partially neurological. The brain is designed to adapt quickly. Pleasure fades through repetition. Psychologists call this hedonic adaptation. What once felt extraordinary slowly becomes normal. That is why humans constantly reset emotional expectations. The dream job becomes stressful routine. The exciting achievement becomes ordinary identity. The impossible goal becomes not enough. And for emotionally healthy people, this adaptation is manageable. But for people whose self-worth depends on achievement, it becomes psychologically dangerous. Because now the person is not only chasing success, they are chasing emotional stability. And emotional stability cannot survive inside constant comparison and conditional self-worth. That is why many high achievers secretly live in permanent dissatisfaction. Not because they are ungrateful. Because their nervous system became addicted to achievement as emotional regulation. Achievement temporarily silences insecurity. It creates a momentary feeling of worth, control, importance, relief. But temporary emotional relief is not fulfillment. Fulfillment is stable, internal, grounded. Relief is temporary. And many ambitious people spend years confusing the two. This creates a psychological addiction to the next goal. The mind begins believing, I will finally feel complete after the next achievement. But the finish line keeps moving. Always. Because the real problem was never external. It was emotional. And emotional emptiness cannot be permanently solved through external accumulation. No amount of success can repair an identity built on self-rejection. This is why some of the most successful people in the world remain emotionally restless. They achieved everything externally while remaining disconnected internally. That contradiction creates silent suffering. Especially because nobody expects successful people to feel empty. From the outside, their lives look impressive. People admire them, envy them, respect them. But internally, they may feel exhausted by the endless pressure to maintain identity through performance. Because success creates another psychological burden people rarely discuss, fear of losing it. The more identity depends on achievement, the more terrifying failure becomes. A successful person no longer fears only financial loss or embarrassment. They fear identity collapse. If achievement created self-worth, then failure threatens self-worth. This creates chronic anxiety beneath many ambitious lives. The person cannot relax because their nervous system constantly monitors performance. They become emotionally trapped inside maintenance mode. Protect the image. Maintain the status. Keep producing. Keep proving. Keep winning. And eventually, achievement stops feeling exciting. It starts feeling necessary. That is one of the clearest signs ambition has become emotional survival instead of healthy growth. The person no longer pursues goals from inspiration. They pursue them from fear. Fear of slowing down. Fear of becoming irrelevant. Fear of losing admiration. Fear of confronting emotional emptiness underneath the performance. That is why stillness becomes psychologically uncomfortable for many high achievers. Rest removes distraction. Silence removes stimulation. And suddenly, unresolved emotions become visible. The person notices exhaustion, loneliness, emptiness, anxiety, meaninglessness. These feelings were always present. Achievement simply distracted the mind from experiencing them fully. This is why some people become addicted to productivity itself. Not because they love working constantly. Because movement prevents emotional confrontation. The moment they stop moving, uncomfortable truths begin surfacing. Questions like, why do I feel worthless when I rest? Why does success never feel like enough? Why am I exhausted even after achieving what I wanted? Why do I still feel emotionally insecure? These questions terrify people whose identity depends on performance. Because the answers threaten the entire emotional structure they built their life around. Many ambitious people unconsciously organize their lives to avoid these realizations. Constant work. Constant goals. Constant stimulation. Constant noise. But eventually, every nervous system reaches its limit. No human being can permanently live inside performance mode without emotional consequences. Eventually, burnout appears. Or emotional numbness. Or anxiety. Or depression disguised as exhaustion. And often, the person does not understand why. Because externally, everything appears successful. But internal fulfillment cannot exist when identity remains emotionally unstable. This is one of the biggest lies modern culture sells ambitious people, that achievement automatically creates peace. It does not. Achievement amplifies whatever identity already exists underneath it. A peaceful person may enjoy success deeply. An emotionally ashamed person may use success to temporarily escape themselves. Externally identical outcomes. Internally opposite experiences. That distinction matters enormously. Because many people spend years trying to heal emotionally through accomplishment. But accomplishment cannot replace emotional self-worth. The nervous system eventually recognizes the difference. That is why many successful people secretly feel disconnected from their own achievements. The excitement fades too quickly. The satisfaction feels temporary. The emptiness returns. And eventually, they realize something painful. I built a successful life. But I do not know how to feel fulfilled inside it. This realization often creates existential crisis. Not because success is meaningless. Because achievement exposed emotional wounds distraction previously covered. Without emotional healing, success becomes psychological amplification. The insecure become more insecure. The anxious become more anxious. The emotionally empty become more aware of emptiness. Because external success removes excuses. The person can no longer say, I will feel okay once I achieve more. Now they have achievement. And the emotional pain still exists. That realization changes people deeply. Some become cynical. Others become emotionally exhausted. Some continue chasing larger goals hoping fulfillment eventually appears. Others finally begin questioning the emotional foundation underneath their ambition. That questioning becomes the beginning of transformation. Because awareness interrupts unconscious cycles. For the first time, the person begins separating achievement from identity, productivity from worth, success from emotional safety. This shift changes ambition completely. The person still works hard. Still grows. Still creates. But achievement stops carrying impossible emotional responsibility. It no longer needs to repair shame. Or create worthiness. Or silence insecurity. It becomes expression instead of emotional survival. And paradoxically, many people perform better psychologically after this shift. Because fear no longer controls every decision. Rest becomes possible. Relationships become more authentic. Failure becomes survivable. Success becomes enjoyable instead of emotionally necessary. Peace becomes possible. Not because ambition disappeared, because self-worth stopped depending entirely on achievement. That emotional freedom changes the entire experience of success. For the first time, the person can pursue greatness without being psychologically imprisoned by it. And that is the difference between healthy ambition and endless emotional hunger. One creates growth. The other creates emptiness disguised as achievement. Because no external victory can permanently satisfy a person secretly trying to escape themselves. Eventually, every ambitious person must answer one question: am I chasing success? Or running from emotional inadequacy? That answer determines whether achievement becomes fulfillment, or an endless cycle of temporary relief followed by deeper exhaustion. Chapter 5. The loneliness of being strong. The world admires strong people, but it rarely asks what strength costs them emotionally. Because strength is often misunderstood. People imagine strength as confidence, control, resilience, discipline, and sometimes it is. But sometimes strength is simply a person learning how to suffer silently. A person becoming so emotionally self-contained that nobody notices they are struggling. That is the hidden loneliness many high achievers carry. They become emotionally reliable for everyone else, while secretly feeling emotionally invisible themselves. The strong one, the dependable one, the composed one, the leader, the provider, the person who always seems okay. Over time, these identities become emotional prisons. Because once someone becomes known as strong, people stop checking if they are hurting. And eventually, the strong person stops checking too. They stop asking for help, stop expressing vulnerability, stop admitting exhaustion, not because they no longer feel pain, because pain started feeling inconvenient. This pattern often begins early in life. Some children become emotionally responsible long before adulthood. They comfort others instead of being comforted, solve problems instead of expressing emotions, remain mature during chaos, become easy for overwhelmed parents, become emotionally independent too early. And from the outside, this behavior appears impressive. People praise them. You're so mature, you're so strong, you handle everything, you never complain. But emotionally, the child learns something dangerous. My value comes from carrying pressure without needing support. That belief follows many people into adulthood. Especially ambitious people. They become addicted to being needed. Needed by family. Needed by work. Needed by relationships. Needed by society. Because usefulness became identity. And while being dependable can feel meaningful, it can also become emotionally isolating. Because people who are always needed are rarely allowed to collapse. Others depend on their stability, their discipline, their composure. So they continue performing strength even when emotionally exhausted. This creates profound loneliness. Not physical loneliness. Psychological loneliness. The feeling that nobody truly knows your internal reality. That everyone sees your performance, but not your pain. Many high achievers experience relationships this way. People admire them, respect them, depend on them. But emotional intimacy remains shallow. Because emotionally armored people struggle to let themselves be seen honestly. Vulnerability feels dangerous. Exposure feels risky. Need feels uncomfortable. So they become emotionally self-sufficient. At least externally. Internally, however, the nervous system still craves connection. Human beings are not designed for emotional isolation. No matter how independent someone appears, the mind still longs for understanding, safety, emotional closeness, acceptance without performance. But strong people often do not know how to receive these things anymore. Because they built identity around emotional control. The idea of needing support threatens that identity. Especially for men. Many men are emotionally conditioned to associate vulnerability with weakness. They are taught, handle it yourself, do not burden others, stay strong. Nobody is coming to save you. Over time, emotional suppression becomes masculine identity. The man learns to convert emotional pain into work, discipline, silence, productivity, anger, isolation. But unexpressed emotions do not disappear. They accumulate internally. And eventually, the emotional pressure becomes unbearable. This is why many emotionally isolated men experience sudden psychological collapse later in life. Not because they were weak. Because they carried emotional pressure alone for too long. The nervous system eventually reaches capacity. And when collapse finally happens, people around them are often shocked. Because externally, the person looked stable, successful, controlled, strong. But external composure is not internal peace. Many high achievers are functioning while emotionally overwhelmed. They simply learned how to hide it effectively. This emotional hiding becomes especially dangerous in leadership positions. Leaders often feel psychologically trapped inside competence. They fear vulnerability may reduce authority. So they continue appearing calm while privately struggling. The CEO, the athlete, the entrepreneur, the father, the creator, the high performer, everyone depends on them emotionally. But they feel unable to depend on anyone else. That imbalance creates exhaustion. Because carrying pressure without emotional release slowly damages the nervous system. And many ambitious people never realize how lonely they truly are until silence arrives. At night. After achievement. After work ends. After distraction disappears. Then the emotional emptiness becomes visible. Not because nobody loves them. Because they stopped allowing themselves to be emotionally known. That distinction matters. Many strong people secretly believe, if people see the real version of me, I will lose respect. So they hide weakness, hide fear, hide confusion, hide sadness, hide exhaustion. And over time, the performance becomes automatic. Even during relationships. Even around people they trust. Some high achievers become so emotionally guarded that they cannot relax emotionally even in intimacy. They remain psychologically on. Always composed. Always controlled. Always monitoring themselves. This prevents deep emotional connection. Because intimacy requires vulnerability. And vulnerability threatens emotionally performance-based identities. That is why many ambitious people experience admiration without closeness. People appreciate them. But few people truly understand them. The stronger the mask becomes, the lonelier life often feels underneath it. And eventually, emotional suppression begins affecting every part of life. Relationships feel distant. Rest feels uncomfortable. Conversations feel performative. Achievement feels emotionally necessary. The person becomes disconnected not only from others, but from themselves. Because emotional suppression eventually disconnects people from their own internal experience. They stop asking, "What do I genuinely feel?" Instead, they ask, "What should I do next?" This creates emotionally efficient lives, but emotionally empty ones. Many strong people become excellent at functioning while deeply disconnected internally. That is why some high achievers secretly fear emotional stillness. Stillness removes distraction. Without constant goals and responsibilities, unresolved loneliness becomes visible. And loneliness is difficult to confront for people who spent years proving they did not need anyone. But emotional independence is not the same as emotional health. True emotional strength is not avoiding vulnerability. It is surviving vulnerability without losing yourself. That requires courage. Far more courage than emotional suppression. Because emotional honesty threatens identities built around performance and control. The strong person must eventually confront difficult truths. I am exhausted. I feel alone. I am scared. I need support. Achievement is not replacing connection. These realizations feel deeply uncomfortable at first. Especially for people conditioned to associate need with weakness. But healing begins exactly there. The moment someone stops performing in vulnerability, real emotional connection becomes possible. For the first time, relationships stop revolving around performance. The person no longer needs to appear perfect to deserve love, or composed to deserve connection, or useful to deserve care. This emotional shift changes everything. Because psychologically healthy relationships are not built on perfection. They are built on honesty. And honesty requires emotional exposure. That exposure feels terrifying for many ambitious people. Because if strength became identity, then vulnerability feels like identity death. But in reality, vulnerability often becomes the beginning of emotional freedom. The person realizes, I do not need to perform strength every second to deserve connection. That realization softens the nervous system. Pressure decreases. Relationships deepen. Loneliness weakens. Not because life becomes easier. Because emotional authenticity replaces emotional performance. And for many high achievers, this becomes one of the most transformative moments of their lives. The moment they realize, being admired is not the same as being loved. Being needed is not the same as being known. And appearing strong is not the same as feeling emotionally safe. True strength is not emotional isolation. True strength is remaining emotionally human while carrying responsibility. That balance is rare. Because modern culture teaches people how to achieve, before teaching them how to connect honestly. And that is why so many successful people secretly feel alone. Not because they failed socially. Because somewhere along the way, they learned, to survive, I must never let people see me breaking. But human beings were never designed to carry life alone. Even the strongest minds eventually need emotional rest. Even the most disciplined people need understanding. Even high achievers need permission to exist without constantly proving they are unbreakable. Because strength without connection eventually becomes exhaustion. And exhaustion without honesty eventually becomes collapse. Chapter 6. Validation. The invisible drug. Most people do not realize how addicted they are to validation. Because validation rarely looks dangerous. It looks normal. Likes, praise, recognition, attention, approval, admiration. Human beings naturally want acceptance. That is not weakness. It is biology. The nervous system is designed to seek belonging because, historically, belonging meant survival. But modern culture transformed validation into something far more powerful. Something constant. Something addictive. Today, millions of people wake up every morning and immediately check whether the world still notices them. Notifications. Messages. Views. Followers. Comments. Approval has become measurable, public, permanent. And for ambitious people, validation can become emotional oxygen. Not because they are shallow. Because many never learned how to feel valuable internally. So they search for worth externally. This search often begins long before social media. A child performs well and receives praise. An athlete wins and receives admiration. A student achieves and finally feels important. The nervous system remembers this emotional reward. Achievement creates recognition. Recognition creates temporary emotional relief. And slowly, the mind begins associating external approval with emotional safety. That association becomes dangerous later in life. Because external validation is unstable. It depends on performance, public opinion, relevance, appearance, productivity, success. None of these things remain constant forever. Which means a person emotionally dependent on validation can never fully relax psychologically. Their identity remains vulnerable to external reactions. This creates chronic emotional insecurity beneath many ambitious lives. The person constantly asks invisible questions. Am I still impressive? Do people still admire me? Am I falling behind? Am I still important? Do I still matter? These questions quietly shape behavior. Even when the person appears confident externally. That is why validation addiction is so psychologically deceptive. The person may look highly successful, while secretly depending on external approval for emotional stability. This creates enormous pressure. Because external validation never fully satisfies the nervous system. It creates temporary relief. Then disappears. And once the relief fades, insecurity returns stronger. So the person searches for more. More attention. More recognition. More success. More proof they matter. This emotional cycle resembles addiction psychologically. Not because praise itself is harmful. Because emotionally dependent people begin using validation to regulate self-worth. That dependence becomes exhausting. Especially in the digital age. Social media intensified human comparison beyond anything previous generations experienced. People no longer compare themselves occasionally. Now comparison is constant. Every scroll becomes psychological evaluation. Someone richer, more attractive, more successful, more disciplined, more admired, more accomplished. The nervous system absorbs these comparisons continuously. And eventually, many people begin feeling emotionally behind in life. Not because they failed. Because they are measuring themselves against endless curated performances online. This creates invisible psychological pressure. Especially for ambitious young adults. Many secretly feel, if I am not exceptional, I will become invisible. That fear drives relentless self-optimization. People constantly improve themselves physically, financially, socially, professionally. Again, growth itself is not unhealthy. But when growth becomes emotionally attached to worthiness, peace disappears. The person no longer improves because they are inspired. They improve because they fear irrelevance. And irrelevance feels emotionally threatening to people addicted to validation. This is why public praise can feel emotionally intoxicating. For a brief moment, insecurity disappears. The person feels important, admired, valuable, seen enough. But the emotional high fades quickly. And when it fades, emptiness returns. Sometimes stronger than before, because the nervous system adapted to external reinforcement. That is why many high achievers secretly feel emotionally unstable after success. They experience applause publicly. And emptiness privately. People assume recognition creates fulfillment. But recognition without internal self-worth creates dependency. The person constantly needs another emotional hit. Another victory. Another audience. Another moment of admiration. This explains why some people become psychologically obsessed with image. Not because they are narcissistic. Because identity became externally regulated. How people perceive them determines how they feel about themselves. This creates emotional fragility. Criticism becomes devastating. Rejection becomes unbearable. Failure becomes identity collapse. Because the person is no longer protecting only goals. They are protecting self-worth. And eventually, maintaining identity becomes exhausting. Some people spend their entire lives performing for validation. Trying to remain impressive enough to deserve attention. Attractive enough to deserve love. Successful enough to deserve respect. Productive enough to deserve existence. But the nervous system eventually becomes tired. Because external validation cannot provide permanent emotional security. No audience is large enough. No amount of praise lasts long enough. No achievement permanently silences insecurity. Eventually, many ambitious people experience emotional burnout from being psychologically on all the time. Always visible. Always performing. Always comparing. Always proving. And one day, they begin asking a painful question: who am I when nobody is watching? That question terrifies validation-dependent people. Because they spent years building identity around external reactions. Without applause, they feel emotionally uncertain. Without recognition, they feel invisible. Without productivity, they feel worthless. This is why solitude feels uncomfortable for many high achievers. Solitude removes external feedback. And without feedback, unresolved insecurity becomes visible. The person realizes they do not know how to emotionally validate themselves internally. That realization creates enormous psychological discomfort. But it also creates possibility. Because awareness interrupts emotional dependency. The person finally begins understanding. I have been asking the world to give me a feeling I must learn to build internally. That realization changes everything. For the first time, validation stops controlling identity completely. The person may still appreciate recognition, still enjoy success, still value achievement. But external approval no longer determines emotional worth. This shift creates emotional freedom. Failure becomes survivable. Criticism becomes manageable. Rest becomes possible. Authenticity becomes easier. Because the person no longer needs constant performance to feel valuable. This does not mean becoming emotionally detached from others. Humans naturally care about connection and recognition. The goal is balance, not emotional dependence. Psychologically healthy people enjoy validation without requiring it for identity. That difference matters enormously. Because one's self-worth becomes internal instead of externally dependent, ambition changes completely. The person no longer performs constantly for approval. They create from purpose, curiosity, meaning, expression. Their work becomes less desperate, less fear-driven, more authentic. And paradoxically, people often become more creative after escaping validation addiction. Because fear of judgment weakens, the nervous system relaxes. Identity becomes stable enough to survive imperfection. This emotional stability is rare in modern culture. Because society constantly encourages performance, constant visibility, constant comparison, constant proving. People are rewarded for appearing extraordinary. But internally, many feel emotionally exhausted trying to maintain the performance. Especially online. Many people today are admired publicly while secretly feeling emotionally disconnected privately. The image becomes stronger than the identity underneath it. And maintaining the image becomes psychologically draining. That is why so many ambitious people secretly feel anxious even during success. They fear losing relevance, losing admiration, losing visibility. Because if identity depends on external attention, then silence feels emotionally threatening. But healing begins when someone realizes, I do not need constant recognition to deserve existence. That sentence sounds simple. But psychologically, it is transformational. Especially for people conditioned to earn worth through performance. The moment someone stops asking the world, please tell me I matter, they begin reclaiming emotional power internally. And for many ambitious people, that becomes the beginning of peace. Not because they stop achieving. Because achievement no longer controls their identity completely. They stop confusing attention with love, recognition with worth, admiration with emotional safety, and slowly, something unfamiliar begins appearing in their life, stillness. Not emptiness, not numbness, peaceful stillness. The kind that does not require applause to feel real. Because the most emotionally powerful people are not those constantly admired by the world. They are the ones who remain internally stable, even when nobody is watching. Chapter 7. Burnout and emotional collapse. Burnout does not happen suddenly. It happens quietly, slowly, like emotional erosion. At first, the person simply feels tired, then disconnected, then emotionally numb, then strangely empty. But because high achievers are trained to ignore discomfort, they continue functioning long after the nervous system begins collapsing. That is why burnout is so dangerous. It often hides inside productivity. The person still wakes up early, still works, still answers messages, still performs, still appears disciplined externally, but internally, something is breaking. And many ambitious people do not notice it until the damage becomes severe. Because they were taught to override themselves. Ignore exhaustion. Push harder. Stay focused. Keep going, no matter what. Modern culture rewards this behavior aggressively. People praise relentless work ethic. They celebrate self-sacrifice. They glorify sleeplessness. They call exhaustion dedication. But the nervous system does not care about motivational slogans. Human beings are not machines. No mind can permanently survive chronic emotional pressure without consequences. Eventually, the body begins speaking through symptoms. Anxiety, insomnia, emotional numbness, irritability, detachment, panic attacks, chronic fatigue, loss of motivation, sudden emotional breakdowns. These symptoms are not weakness. They are nervous system alarms. Signals that the mind has been carrying too much pressure for too long. But many high achievers interpret these signals incorrectly. Instead of slowing down, they become more aggressive toward themselves, more disciplined, more self-critical. They believe exhaustion means they are failing, so they push harder. That response often accelerates collapse. Because burnout is rarely caused only by working too much. It is caused by carrying emotional pressure without recovery. A person can work extremely hard and remain psychologically healthy if they feel emotionally connected, internally safe, purposeful, balanced, emotionally honest. But when achievement becomes tied to self-worth, work changes psychologically. Now every task carries emotional pressure. Every failure threatens identity. Every mistake triggers shame. Every moment of rest creates guilt. The nervous system never fully relaxes. And eventually, permanent internal pressure creates emotional exhaustion. This is why many burned out people say strange things like, "I feel tired even after resting." Because the exhaustion is not only physical, it is emotional, psychological, existential. The person is exhausted from carrying identity through performance constantly, exhausted from proving worth, exhausted from suppressing emotion, exhausted from surviving inside pressure for years. And eventually, the mind stops cooperating. Some people experience emotional numbness. Nothing feels exciting anymore. Success feels flat. Motivation disappears. Relationships feel distant. Life becomes mechanical. Others experience anxiety so intense they cannot relax even during silence. Their nervous system becomes trapped in hypervigilance. Always preparing. Always anticipating. Always performing. Some experience sudden breakdowns after years of appearing emotionally strong. They cry unexpectedly, panic unexpectedly, collapse unexpectedly. People around them feel shocked. But psychologically, the collapse was building for years. The nervous system simply reached its limit. That is one of the most misunderstood truths about burnout. People do not break because they are weak. They break because they stayed strong for too long without emotional recovery. This becomes especially dangerous for high achievers because achievement often masks dysfunction. A burned out person may still appear successful externally, still productive, still respected, still admired, which makes it harder to recognize the damage internally. Some people continue functioning professionally while emotionally collapsing privately. They lose connection with joy, with rest, with meaning, with themselves. And eventually, life starts feeling emotionally unreal. This is what chronic self-neglect does psychologically. The person becomes disconnected from their own internal experience. They stop asking, "What do I need emotionally?" and begin asking only, "What still needs to get done?" That mindset may produce achievement, but it destroys emotional sustainability. Because the nervous system eventually rebels against permanent performance. No human being can remain emotionally disconnected forever without consequences. Burnout is often the mind forcing confrontation. The person can no longer outrun themselves psychologically. Distraction stops working. Achievement stops numbing. Validation stops satisfying. And suddenly, unresolved emotional pain surfaces all at once. This phase feels terrifying for many ambitious people, especially because their identity depended on functioning. The disciplined person can no longer focus. The strong person suddenly feels fragile. The productive person loses motivation. The high performer feels emotionally broken. This creates identity crisis. Because many ambitious people built self-worth around competence. When competence weakens, identity destabilizes. That is why burnout often creates emotional panic far beyond exhaustion itself. The person secretly fears, "If I cannot perform, who am I?" That question sits beneath many emotional collapses. Because performance became identity. Without achievement, the person feels psychologically lost. This is why many burned-out individuals feel strangely guilty during recovery. Even while exhausted, they feel pressure to remain productive. Rest feels undeserved. Slowing down feels threatening. Stillness feels emotionally unsafe. The nervous system became addicted to movement. And movement previously protected them from confronting deeper emotions: shame, loneliness, insecurity, fear, emotional emptiness. Now those emotions become impossible to avoid. And many people reach a painful realization: I was not only working for success, I was working to escape myself. That realization changes everything. Because burnout exposes emotional truths achievement previously concealed. The person finally sees how much pressure they carried, how disconnected they became, how emotionally exhausted they truly are, how much self-worth depended on performance. This awareness can feel devastating initially. But it also becomes the beginning of healing. Because awareness interrupts unconscious self-destruction. For the first time, the person begins understanding that constant pressure was never sustainable. That emotional suppression was never strength. That productivity cannot replace peace. That achievement cannot permanently heal internal emptiness. This realization changes ambition itself. The person begins redefining success psychologically. Success is no longer constant exhaustion, emotional suppression, relentless pressure proving worth endlessly. Instead, success becomes emotional stability, internal peace, meaningful growth, sustainable ambition, healthy relationships, self-respect without constant performance. This shift is deeply uncomfortable at first, especially for people addicted to achievement-driven identity. Because slowing down forces emotional confrontation. The person must finally experience emotions they spent years avoiding: fear, sadness, loneliness, grief, exhaustion, emptiness. But emotional healing requires feeling what performance previously suppressed. That process is not weakness. It is nervous system recovery. Many ambitious people fear this phase because they mistake softness for failure. But healing is not the opposite of discipline. Healing is learning how to stop using discipline as self-punishment. That distinction matters enormously. Psychologically healthy ambition still works hard, still grows, still creates. But it no longer destroys the person carrying it. The nervous system finally learns: my worth does not disappear when I rest. That sentence feels revolutionary to emotionally exhausted people. Because many spent their entire lives earning permission to feel valuable. Burnout forces them to confront a different possibility. Maybe existence itself was always enough. That realization softens something deep inside the nervous system. Pressure weakens. Self-hatred decreases. The obsession with constant proving slowly fades. And for the first time in years, maybe even decades, the person begins experiencing something unfamiliar: peace without performance. Not because ambition disappeared, because identity no longer depends entirely on achievement. That emotional freedom changes everything. Because the most dangerous thing about burnout is not exhaustion itself. It is spending years abandoning yourself emotionally in the pursuit of becoming someone valuable. And the most powerful part of healing is realizing you were valuable long before the world applauded you for it. Chapter 8. The fear of slowing down. Some people are not afraid of failure. They are afraid of stillness. Afraid of silence. Afraid of empty space without distraction. Because when movement stops, emotions become louder. And many high achievers have spent their entire lives running. Not always physically. Psychologically. Running from shame, from insecurity, from loneliness, from emotional emptiness. From the terrifying fear that without achievement, they may have no identity at all. This is why slowing down feels dangerous for many ambitious people. Not uncomfortable. Dangerous. The nervous system becomes so dependent on constant motion that rest begins triggering anxiety instead of peace. That is one of the clearest signs someone is emotionally trapped inside performance-based living. A healthy mind experiences rest as recovery. An emotionally exhausted mind experiences rest as exposure. Because stillness removes distraction. And distraction has become emotional survival. That is why many high achievers stay constantly busy even when unnecessary. Always working. Always improving. Always consuming information. Always planning. Always optimizing. Always chasing another version of themselves. From the outside, this behavior looks productive. Internally, however, it is often avoidance. Avoidance of unresolved emotional pain. Many ambitious people unconsciously structure their lives to prevent self-confrontation. Noise protects them. Movement protects them. Goals protect them. As long as the mind remains occupied, deeper emotions remain hidden temporarily. But silence changes everything. Especially at night. When work ends. When the phone becomes quiet. When nobody needs anything. When the distractions disappear. That is when many high achievers encounter themselves honestly for the first time all day. And often, what they find terrifies them. Exhaustion. Loneliness. Emptiness. Anxiety. Meaninglessness. A strange feeling that despite all their effort, something inside still feels incomplete. This is why some people become addicted to future achievement. They emotionally live in tomorrow. The next goal. The next milestone. The next transformation. The next success. Because the future creates psychological escape from the present. As long as fulfillment exists, later, they never have to confront why fulfillment feels absent now. This creates endless emotional postponement. The person quietly believes, I will finally feel okay after one more achievement. But the emotional finish line keeps moving. Always. Because the problem was never only external. It was internal. And unresolved internal pain follows people into every future they create. That is why some people achieve their dream life. And still feel emotionally restless inside it. The environment changed. The identity underneath it did not. This becomes deeply visible during periods of forced stillness. Burnout. Breakups. Failure. Illness. Unemployment. Loneliness. Retirement. Moments where performance slows down unexpectedly. Many ambitious people experience severe emotional discomfort during these periods because achievement previously regulated identity. Without constant progress, the nervous system becomes unstable. The person suddenly asks, who am I without productivity? That question creates panic for people whose worth depends on performance. Because they spent years building identity around doing instead of being. Modern culture encourages this constantly. People are rewarded for output more than presence. More for productivity than emotional health. More for performance than authenticity. A person says, I worked 16 hours today. And society responds with admiration. But almost nobody asks, how is your mind? That silence creates emotionally disconnected achievers. People who know how to produce, but not how to rest. People who know how to succeed, but not how to emotionally exist without proving themselves. This becomes especially dangerous because the nervous system cannot remain in constant performance mode forever. Humans require recovery psychologically. Not only sleep. Emotional recovery, mental stillness, inner safety, connection. But many ambitious people experience these things as unfamiliar, even threatening. Some feel guilty relaxing, guilty enjoying life, guilty doing nothing productive, because somewhere deep inside, they learned, rest must be earned. That belief creates endless internal pressure. The person becomes emotionally incapable of simply existing peacefully. Everything must justify value. Every hour must be useful. Every action must improve something. Even self-care becomes performance. Meditation for optimization. Exercise for image. Reading for productivity. Relationships for status. The mind loses the ability to experience life without turning it into achievement. That is not ambition anymore. That is emotional captivity. And eventually, the nervous system begins resisting. Some people lose motivation entirely. Others develop anxiety around work itself. Some become emotionally numb. Others feel exhausted even during success. This confuses many ambitious people because externally, they still have everything. But internally, they feel disconnected from life itself. Because the human mind cannot survive forever as a machine. Eventually, it demands humanity back. That demand often arrives through emotional collapse. The person suddenly realizes, I do not know how to stop. That realization is terrifying. Especially for people praised their entire lives for endless drive. Because society celebrates people who ignore themselves. Until they break. Then society calls it burnout. But burnout is often years of emotional self-abandonment finally becoming visible. And slowing down forces confrontation with that reality. For the first time, the person notices how exhausted they are, how lonely they feel, how much fear drives them, how little peace exists underneath achievement. This awareness feels overwhelming initially. Because movement previously protected them from these realizations. But eventually, every high achiever faces a painful truth. Constant motion is not the same as inner peace. Some people run so long they forget what they were running from. Achievement becomes automatic. Productivity becomes identity. Stillness becomes intolerable. And because the world rewards output so aggressively, the person may never question the cycle until emotional collapse forces them to. That is why learning to slow down becomes psychologically revolutionary. Not laziness. Not weakness. Reconnection. The person begins discovering parts of themselves buried beneath performance. Emotion. Curiosity. Creativity. Presence. Joy without achievement. Rest without guilt. Silence without panic. At first, this feels unfamiliar. Even uncomfortable. Because the nervous system was conditioned for pressure. Many ambitious people experience anxiety the moment they stop being productive. Their mind immediately searches for another task. Another improvement. Another problem to solve. Because stillness exposes emotional vulnerability. And vulnerability feels unsafe to identities built around control. But healing begins exactly there. Not through more achievement. Through emotional tolerance. The ability to sit with yourself without immediately escaping into productivity. That ability changes everything psychologically. For the first time, the person begins understanding, I do not need constant motion to deserve existence. That realization softens the nervous system profoundly. Pressure decreases. Self-worth stabilizes. Life slows down emotionally, not in ambition. In desperation. The person still pursues goals. Still works hard. Still grows. But no longer from panic. No longer from emotional starvation. No longer from the fear of becoming not enough. This changes the entire experience of success. Achievement stops being emotional survival. It becomes expression. Choice. Creativity. Meaning. And perhaps most importantly, the person finally begins experiencing moments where they are not trying to become someone else constantly. They simply exist. Without proving. Without performing. Without earning permission to feel valuable. That feeling is unfamiliar to many ambitious people. Because they spent years believing worth had to be achieved. But real emotional peace begins when someone realizes, I was never supposed to earn my humanity through exhaustion. That realization is not the end of ambition. It is the end of psychological war against yourself. And for many high achievers, that becomes the first truly peaceful moment of their lives. Chapter 9. Rebuilding identity beyond achievement. One of the hardest things a high achiever can experience is realizing they do not know who they are without performance. Not what they do. Not what they produce. Not what they achieve. Who they are. That realization often arrives after burnout. After emotional collapse. After success feels strangely empty. After years of chasing validation, the person suddenly notices something terrifying. Everything I built my identity around can disappear. Money can disappear. Status can disappear. Recognition can disappear. Beauty can fade. Success can change. Audiences move on. Careers shift. Achievements become old news. And if identity depends entirely on those things, the nervous system remains permanently fragile. This is why many ambitious people secretly live with chronic anxiety. Because their self-worth depends on unstable external conditions. The mind constantly asks, what happens if I fail? What happens if people stop admiring me? What happens if I slow down? What happens if I am no longer exceptional? These questions reveal something deeper than ambition. They reveal identity fear. The fear that without performance, the person may become emotionally insignificant. That fear controls countless lives silently. People overwork themselves not only for success, but to avoid confronting who they feel they are without it. This is why rebuilding identity becomes one of the most important psychological transformations a high achiever can experience. Because until identity separates from achievement, peace remains impossible. The person remains trapped in emotional dependence. Always proving. Always performing. Always earning worth. But identity built on performance eventually collapses under pressure. Because no human being can sustain perfection forever. Eventually, failure happens. Loss happens. Aging happens. Rejection happens. Exhaustion happens. And when those moments arrive, performance-based identities begin breaking apart. That collapse feels devastating initially. But psychologically, it can also become liberation. Because for the first time, the person is forced to ask, if I am not my achievements, then who am I? Most people avoid this question for years. Some for entire lifetimes. Because achievement creates distraction, the person stays busy enough to avoid deeper self-confrontation. But once distraction weakens, identity confusion surfaces powerfully. Many ambitious people realize they spent years developing skills, while neglecting their relationship with themselves. They know how to succeed professionally, but not emotionally. They know how to impress people, but not how to feel internally safe. They know how to achieve goals, but not how to exist peacefully without goals. This realization can feel deeply painful, especially because society rewards performance more than self-awareness. People are taught how to compete before learning how to emotionally understand themselves. So many high achievers grow into adults with extraordinary discipline, and almost no emotional foundation underneath it. That is why rebuilding identity requires something unfamiliar: internal self-worth. Not self-esteem based on success. Not confidence based on performance. Something deeper. The understanding that your humanity has value independent of achievement. This idea sounds simple intellectually, but emotionally, it feels revolutionary to people conditioned to earn worth through performance. Because performance-based identities always ask, what have you done to deserve value today? Healthy identity asks, why would your humanity require earning? That difference changes the entire nervous system. A person no longer needs constant proof of worth. They stop treating themselves like machines. Stop measuring their existence through productivity alone. Stop believing rest reduces value. This shift is psychologically difficult at first, because many ambitious people built their entire emotional survival system around achievement. Without performance, they feel exposed, empty, directionless. Some even feel guilty relaxing because their nervous system associates stillness with failure. That is how deeply performance conditioning can shape identity. But rebuilding identity means slowly separating worth from productivity, love from usefulness, existence from achievement, humanity from performance. That process requires emotional honesty. The person must finally confront truths they spent years avoiding. Truths like, I do not know how to feel valuable without succeeding. I built my identity around being needed. I fear becoming ordinary. I have been performing strength for most of my life. These realizations hurt. But they also create freedom. Because unconscious emotional patterns lose power once consciously understood. For the first time, the person begins seeing themselves clearly. Not as a performer. Not as a productivity machine. As a human being. A human being with fears, needs, emotions, limits, pain, dreams beyond external validation. This emotional reconnection changes life profoundly. The person begins asking different questions. Not, how can I become more impressive? But, what kind of life actually feels meaningful? That question changes ambition itself. Because many people discover they were chasing things they never genuinely wanted. Some chased money for approval. Others chased status for identity. Some chased perfection to avoid shame. Others chased success because they feared emotional invisibility. Once these unconscious motivations become visible, ambition transforms. The person may still pursue greatness. But no longer from desperation. No longer from emotional starvation. No longer from self-rejection. Instead, ambition becomes aligned with values, purpose, expression, contribution, curiosity, growth without self-hatred. This shift creates emotional sustainability. Failure no longer destroys identity completely. Criticism becomes survivable. Rest becomes possible. Relationships deepen. Because the person no longer needs to constantly protect a fragile performance-based image. That is one of the hidden benefits of emotional healing. Authenticity becomes less terrifying. The person no longer fears being ordinary as intensely because worth is no longer dependent on superiority. This does not eliminate ambition. It eliminates psychological desperation. And desperation is what exhausts so many high achievers. The constant internal feeling, I must become more or I will not be enough. Once that pressure weakens, life changes emotionally. Success becomes enjoyable instead of necessary. Work becomes meaningful instead of identity-saving. Rest becomes recovery instead of guilt. Relationships become emotionally real instead of performative. And perhaps most importantly, the person finally begins developing something many ambitious people never had growing up: internal safety. The feeling that failure does not erase worth. That slowing down does not erase value. That vulnerability does not erase strength. That being human does not require perfection. This emotional safety changes the nervous system profoundly. Pressure decreases. Comparison weakens. Validation loses power. The person stops living in permanent psychological defense mode. And slowly, identity becomes stable enough to survive imperfection. That stability is real confidence. Not arrogance. Not performance. Internal stability. The ability to exist without constantly proving yourself. Most people mistake confidence for superiority. But psychologically healthy confidence is much quieter. It says, I can fail without hating myself. I can rest without guilt. I can be imperfect without feeling worthless. I do not need constant applause to feel valuable. That kind of confidence cannot be built through achievement alone. It must be developed internally. And many high achievers spend years learning this lesson. Because eventually, every ambitious person discovers something success alone cannot teach. You cannot build a peaceful life on top of self-rejection. Eventually, identity must become stronger than performance. Otherwise every setback becomes emotional destruction. That is why rebuilding identity matters so deeply. Not because ambition is wrong. Because no achievement should require abandoning yourself emotionally. And the moment someone finally understands, my worth exists before my performance, their entire relationship with success changes forever. For the first time, they stop chasing achievement to become enough. And start creating from a place of already being enough. Chapter 10. Becoming Whole Again. There comes a moment in many ambitious people's lives when they grow tired of performing. Not tired of creating. Not tired of building. Not tired of growing. Tired of carrying the emotional pressure of proving their worth every second of their existence. That moment changes everything. Because eventually, achievement stops feeling exciting when it is built on self-rejection. The nervous system becomes exhausted. The mind becomes heavy. The soul becomes disconnected, and the person realizes something painful. I spent years becoming successful, while abandoning myself emotionally. That realization is not failure. It is awakening. For the first time, the person begins seeing the difference between ambition and emotional survival. Between growth and self-punishment. Between discipline and self-neglect. And once someone sees that difference clearly, they cannot unsee it. The old way of living begins feeling emotionally unbearable. Constant proving. Constant pressure. Constant comparison. Constant performance. The person finally understands. I do not want to spend my entire life earning permission to feel valuable. That realization becomes the beginning of wholeness. Because healing is not becoming less ambitious. Healing is becoming emotionally integrated. No longer split between the public self and the hidden self, performance and authenticity, achievement and self-worth, strength and vulnerability. Wholeness means the person no longer needs to wear emotional armor constantly. They stop treating vulnerability like danger. Stop treating rest like weakness. Stop treating humanity like failure. For many high achievers, this emotional shift feels unfamiliar at first. Almost uncomfortable. Because the nervous system was conditioned for pressure. Chaos became normal. Stress became identity. Productivity became emotional regulation. Without those things, the person initially feels lost. This phase is important psychologically. Because when performance addiction weakens, unresolved emotions often surface. Grief. Loneliness. Fear. Sadness. Regret. Exhaustion. Not because healing is making things worse. Because the mind is finally allowing itself to feel what it spent years suppressing. This emotional release is part of becoming whole again. The nervous system stops surviving and begins reconnecting. For the first time in years, maybe decades, the person asks different questions. Not, how can I become more impressive? But, what actually makes me feel alive? That question changes life completely. Because many ambitious people built lives optimized for admiration, not emotional fulfillment. They became who the world respected, not always who they genuinely were. Healing requires rediscovering that lost self. The self buried beneath expectation, beneath pressure, beneath performance, beneath survival. That rediscovery often begins quietly. Moments of rest without guilt. Conversations without performance. Creating without needing applause. Existing without constantly measuring worth. At first, these moments feel small. But psychologically, they are revolutionary. Because emotionally exhausted people are not only tired from working hard. They are tired from being psychologically disconnected from themselves. Wholeness reconnects that relationship. The person slowly learns, I can still be ambitious without hating myself. I can still grow without feeling inadequate. I can still pursue greatness without abandoning peace. That balance changes everything. Because ambition without self-worth creates endless hunger. But ambition with emotional stability creates meaning. The person no longer chases success to repair identity. They pursue goals because expression feels natural. Curiosity feels alive. Purpose feels meaningful. Growth becomes joyful instead of desperate. And perhaps for the first time, success actually becomes emotionally satisfying. Not because achievement changed. Because the relationship with achievement changed. The person is no longer asking success to provide identity, emotional safety, worthiness, self-love, inner peace. Those things are finally being built internally. That internal foundation transforms life. Failure stops feeling like emotional annihilation. Rest stops feeling shameful. Comparison loses power. Validation becomes enjoyable instead of necessary. Relationships deepen because authenticity replaces performance. And the nervous system finally experiences something it may not have felt for years: safety. Not external safety, internal safety. The feeling that existence itself is enough. That feeling is difficult to describe to people who spent their lives proving themselves. Because performance-based living creates constant internal tension. The mind always asks, what else must I do to deserve value? Wholeness dissolves that question slowly. The person begins understanding, my humanity was never supposed to be earned. That realization softens something deep inside the nervous system. Pressure weakens. Fear decreases. Life becomes less performative, more real. Many ambitious people fear this transformation initially. They believe self-acceptance will destroy ambition. But psychologically, the opposite often happens. When shame stops driving achievement, creativity expands. Energy becomes sustainable. Discipline becomes healthier. The person no longer wastes emotional energy fighting themselves internally. That energy becomes available for life itself. For love. For meaning. For creation. For presence. For joy. This is the hidden truth many high achievers eventually discover. Peace is not the enemy of ambition. Self-hatred is. Self-hatred creates pressure, fear, burnout, emotional emptiness. But peace creates clarity, consistency, purpose, emotional resilience. The healthiest ambitious people are not emotionally numb machines. They are emotionally connected humans with direction. People capable of both strength and softness, discipline and rest, achievement and vulnerability. That integration is real maturity, not emotional suppression. Modern culture often celebrates emotionally disconnected success. But disconnected people eventually collapse internally. Because human beings cannot survive permanently divided from themselves. Eventually, authenticity becomes psychologically necessary. The person grows tired of pretending. Tired of proving. Tired of carrying impossible emotional expectations. And slowly, they begin allowing themselves to become human again. To laugh without productivity. To rest without guilt. To exist without performance. To love without conditions. To fail without self-destruction. To feel emotions without shame. This transformation is not dramatic externally. Often, the outside life looks similar. The person may still work hard, still pursue greatness, still build extraordinary things, but internally, everything changes. The war ends. No longer fighting themselves constantly. No longer chasing worth through exhaustion. No longer treating life like an endless audition for value. Instead, they begin living from wholeness. And wholeness creates a different kind of success. A quieter success. One the world may not always recognize immediately. But internally, it changes everything. Because the person finally understands, achievement means nothing if you lose yourself becoming successful. That truth becomes emotionally undeniable. And once it does, life begins reorganizing around something deeper than performance. Around meaning, presence, authenticity, peace. Not the fragile peace created by temporary success. Real peace. The kind that remains even when nobody is applauding. Even during failure. Even during uncertainty. Even during stillness. Because identity is no longer built entirely on achievement. It is built on something stronger. Self-worth. And once someone develops self-worth independent of performance, ambition becomes free instead of desperate. The person no longer chases success to become enough. They create from the understanding that they already are. That is what becoming whole again truly means. Not losing ambition. Losing the belief that suffering is required to deserve existence. Losing the addiction to proving. Losing the fear of being ordinary. Losing the performance mask. and finally becoming someone who can achieve greatly, without abandoning themselves in the process. That is the emotional journey hidden beneath so many ambitious lives. And perhaps the most important realization of all is this: the strongest people are not the ones who never feel pain. They are the ones who stop hiding from themselves. Because true success is not becoming emotionally invincible. True success is becoming fully human again. Conclusion. The emotion high achievers never show. There is one emotion many high achievers spend their entire lives hiding. Not sadness. Not fear. Not anger. Exhaustion. Deep emotional exhaustion. The exhaustion of constantly performing. Constantly proving. Constantly carrying pressure. Constantly trying to become enough. This exhaustion rarely appears publicly. Because high achievers become experts at looking functional while emotionally overwhelmed. They smile while burned out. Lead while emotionally disconnected. Create while internally collapsing. And the world applauds them for their discipline, without realizing how much pain their performance is hiding. That is the tragedy of modern ambition. People are rewarded for abandoning themselves emotionally. The more pressure someone tolerates silently, the stronger they appear. The more exhaustion they hide, the more impressive they seem. But hidden exhaustion does not disappear. It accumulates. Inside the nervous system, inside identity, inside relationships, inside silence. Until eventually, something breaks. Not because the person was weak. Because no human being was designed to survive as a permanent performance. This book was never about destroying ambition. Ambition is not the enemy. The enemy is believing your humanity must be earned through suffering. Believing your worth depends on achievement. Believing rest makes you lazy. Believing vulnerability makes you weak. Believing failure makes you worthless. These beliefs quietly shape millions of lives. Especially among ambitious people. People who appear successful externally while secretly feeling emotionally empty internally. People admired by the world, but disconnected from themselves. Throughout this journey, one truth has appeared again and again: achievement can improve your life. But it cannot replace self-worth. No amount of applause can permanently heal shame. No amount of success can permanently silence insecurity. No amount of validation can permanently create inner peace. Because peace is not built externally. It is built psychologically, emotionally, internally. And many high achievers spend years searching outside themselves for a feeling that can only be created within. That search becomes exhausting. The endless pressure to become more, do more, earn more, prove more, win more. And eventually, many people realize something painful: I do not even know what I am chasing anymore. That moment matters. Because it is often the beginning of awakening. The beginning of emotional honesty. The beginning of separating identity from performance. The beginning of becoming human again. Not weaker. Human. There is a massive difference. Modern culture often treats emotional numbness like strength. But numbness is not strength. Suppression is not mastery. Exhaustion is not ambition. And self-destruction is not discipline. Real strength is emotional awareness. The ability to remain connected to yourself while carrying responsibility. The ability to pursue greatness without abandoning peace. The ability to fail without hating yourself. The ability to rest without guilt. The ability to exist without constant proving. That kind of strength is rare. Because most people were taught how to perform before they were taught how to emotionally live. So they become adults searching for worth in achievement. Searching for identity in validation. Searching for peace in productivity. And eventually discovering none of those things can permanently provide what emotional safety creates internally. That realization changes life completely. Because once someone understands, my worth is not dependent on performance, everything begins shifting psychologically. Success becomes expression instead of survival. Relationships become more honest. Rest becomes recovery instead of shame. Failure becomes painful but survivable. Life becomes less performative, more authentic. And perhaps for the first time, the person begins experiencing something many ambitious people secretly crave more than success itself: peace. Not temporary relief after achievement. Real peace. The kind that remains even during uncertainty. Even during silence. Even when nobody is watching. That peace is possible. But only when a person stops treating themselves like a machine designed solely for output. Only when they stop asking achievement to provide identity. Only when they stop confusing admiration with self-worth. Only when they stop running from themselves. This does not mean becoming passive, or abandoning goals, or rejecting ambition. It means becoming psychologically free enough to pursue ambition without emotional slavery. To create without desperation. To work without self-hatred. To grow without believing you are broken. To succeed without losing yourself. That is the emotional transformation many high achievers truly need. Not more pressure. Not more discipline. Not another productivity system. Permission to exist without constantly earning value. Because the truth is, many ambitious people are not chasing success anymore. They are chasing relief. Relief from shame. Relief from insecurity. Relief from the fear of not being enough. But relief built on external achievement never lasts. Eventually, the nervous system demands something deeper: self-acceptance. Not arrogance. Not complacency. Self-acceptance. The understanding that your humanity has value even when you are tired. Even when you fail. Even when you are uncertain. Even when you are not performing. That understanding changes ambition from emotional survival into meaningful expression. And perhaps that is the final lesson hidden beneath all achievement. The goal was never to become emotionally invincible. The goal was to stop abandoning yourself while trying to become someone worthy of love. Because you were never supposed to earn your humanity through exhaustion. You were never supposed to destroy yourself to deserve existence. You were never supposed to carry life alone. And maybe the strongest thing a high achiever can finally say is, "I am tired of proving I deserve to be human." That sentence is not weakness. It is freedom. Because healing begins the moment performance stops being more important than truth. The moment someone finally removes the mask. The moment someone stops asking, "How impressive can I become?" and starts asking, "How honestly can I live?" That question changes everything. Because at the end of all ambition, all achievement, all recognition, and all success, every human being still wants the same thing: to feel enough without constantly proving it. And the people who finally learn that truth are not the ones who achieve the least. Often, they are the ones who finally learn how to achieve greatly, without losing themselves in the process. Epilogue. The quiet life after the performance ends. There is a strange silence that appears after emotional awakening. Not emptiness. Not sadness. Silence. The kind that arrives when a person stops fighting themselves constantly. At first, that silence feels unfamiliar. Almost uncomfortable. Because many high achievers spend their entire lives surrounded by noise, pressure, deadlines, comparison, expectations, internal criticism, endless goals. The mind becomes addicted to psychological movement. So when the performance finally slows down, the nervous system does not immediately know how to exist peacefully. Many people mistake this phase for losing ambition. But something deeper is happening. For the first time, they are no longer running. And people who spent years outrunning themselves often feel disoriented when they stop. Because movement gave them identity. Pressure gave them structure. Achievement gave them temporary relief. Without those things controlling every moment, they finally encounter a question that changes everything. What kind of life do I actually want? Not the life that impresses others. Not the life that earns validation. Not the life built around fear. A real life. One that feels emotionally honest. This question becomes the beginning of a quieter transformation. The person starts noticing things they ignored for years. Sunlight in the morning. Conversations without performance. Rest without guilt. Moments without urgency. Laughter without needing productivity attached to it. The nervous system slowly begins learning safety again. Not safety through achievement. Safety through presence. That process takes time. Especially for people conditioned to believe their value depended on output. Some days, old patterns return. The urge to overwork. The fear of slowing down. The anxiety of being forgotten. The pressure to prove worth again. Healing is not linear. Years of emotional conditioning do not disappear overnight. But awareness changes the relationship with those patterns. Now the person notices them consciously, instead of automatically obeying them. That awareness creates choice, and choice creates freedom. Slowly, the high achiever begins redefining success completely. Success is no longer destroying your health for admiration, sacrificing peace for status, becoming emotionally numb for productivity, earning love through usefulness. Success becomes waking up without dread, feeling emotionally connected to yourself, having relationships where performance is unnecessary, resting without shame, pursuing goals without self-hatred, feeling internally enough even during imperfection. This kind of success looks quieter externally, but psychologically, it is far more powerful, because it is sustainable. Real peace always is. The person may still build extraordinary things, still create, still lead, still dream. But the energy underneath ambition changes. It no longer comes from desperation, or fear, or emotional starvation. It comes from alignment, from meaning, from genuine desire instead of psychological escape. And ironically, this often produces better work. Not because pressure increased, because internal resistance decreased. The mind becomes clearer when it is no longer consumed by self-rejection. Creativity expands when shame weakens. Relationships deepen when masks disappear. Life becomes emotionally richer when performance stops dominating identity. That is the hidden transformation most people never see publicly. Because the greatest victories in life are often invisible. The moment someone forgives themselves for being imperfect. The moment someone rests without guilt. The moment someone stops needing constant validation. The moment someone realizes, I do not need to become extraordinary to deserve love. Those moments change lives quietly. More quietly than success. More quietly than applause, but far more deeply. Many people spend their whole lives trying to be admired. Very few learn how to feel internally at peace. And peace is harder. Because peace requires honesty. It requires removing emotional armor. Letting go of identities built on suffering. Accepting that vulnerability is part of being human, not evidence of weakness. The high achiever who learns this becomes different from the one the world originally praised. Still ambitious, but softer internally. Still disciplined, but no longer cruel to themselves. Still growing, but no longer believing growth is required to deserve existence. This emotional shift changes the entire experience of life. Moments become more real. Relationships become more intimate. Achievement becomes more meaningful. Because now success is being added to an already valuable life, not used to repair an emotionally broken identity. That difference changes everything. And maybe that is what emotional maturity truly is. The ability to pursue greatness without losing connection to your humanity. Not abandoning ambition. Abandoning the belief that pain is the price of worthiness. Because in the end, the people who truly heal are not the ones who stop dreaming. They are the ones who stop hating themselves while they dream. And perhaps the final truth every exhausted high achiever eventually discovers is this: your life was never meant to be a performance. It was meant to be lived.